Researching and organizing family history allows me to see the timeline in an interesting and unique way. I'm not just looking at family history, I'm like a passenger on a journey as the story unfolds. As I mentioned in a previous episode, I was born in Miami, my father in Cuba, and my grandfather in Spain. That's a lot of movement within 3 generations within the 20th century. My grandfather Eloy left Spain at the age of 18 on September 11th, 1930 on the Cristobal Colon ship. He settled in Aguada de Pasajeros, Cuba, where his uncle Gregorio Escagedo Salmon lived, and there were other Cantabrians living there in the early 1900s as well. My grandfather eventually met and married my grandmother Ramona in 1941, and she was born there in 1911. In 1942, my dad was born, Eloy Escagedo Lliraldi. The family owned a store called La Francia. Back in Spain, my grandfather had left his family behind, his father Patricio Felix and his sister Balbina, as well as his aunt and uncle Benita and Mateo Escagedo Salmon. Benita and Mateo were siblings. Much of the family never left Spain. We did, through my grandfather. And this was the case along my maternal side as well, with my great-grandparents coming from places such as Malaga and Andalusia, as well as the Canary Islands. A few years back, my cousin Mila in Spain had a surprise for me here in Miami. One day she rang me up on video call with her husband Jose and Milagros, her mother. I had long wanted to see my great-grandfather Felix's resting place at the family pantheon, and they decided to visit the cemetery with me on video.
Aquí tienes a tu bisabuelo.
Many of my aunts, uncles, and cousins also rest there. At that cemetery, there's also the remains of an old Romanesque church entrance, and there's a Roman bath complex below where the church sat. My great-grandfather Patricio Felix Escagedo Salmon died from a trolley car accident on the 13th of August, 1949, in Muriedas, Cantabria, Spain. According to family, he had difficulty hearing, didn't hear or see the trolley car, and was struck while working the fields he tended. He was 64 years old at the time. His son in Cuba was 38, and my father was 7 years old. Decades later, here in Sweetwater, my father showed me a tiny photo of my great-grandfather, and he said that this was the only photo that my grandfather had of his dad, and that he carried it in his wallet all his life. My grandfather was born the 29th of December, 1911 in Maliaño. As mentioned, his father was Patricio Felix Escagedo Salmon, and his mother was Eloisa Elvira Valle Fernandez. Eloisa died while my grandfather and his sister Balbina were still young. Since so many years have passed since my father and I had the conversation, I remember him explaining that Eloisa was involved in a shooting involving a taxi. The details are blurry, and I have newspaper clippings that I believe describe that incident, but I'm still looking for more documentation in order to settle it properly. It turns out that the children were then cared for by their aunt, their father's sister, Benita Escagedo Salmon. And seeing as Benita lived with her brother Mateo, my grandfather grew up alongside him. The priest and official chronicler for the province of Santander, Mateo Escagedo Salmon. Eloy would accompany Mateo on his investigations across Cantabria, and Mateo encouraged him to study for the priesthood, which my grandfather did. But at some point, my grandfather changed his mind and in 1930 immigrated to Cuba. Earlier, I had mentioned that this was the only photo that my grandfather had of his dad, and that he kept it in his wallet everywhere that he'd go. Luckily, a few years back, my cousins in Spain shared a batch of old photos with me, and my great-grandfather is in one of them. Growing up in Sweetwater here in the 80s in Dade County, Florida, my grandparents lived next door and my maternal grandparents not too far away. My grandfather would take me to the movies, the Ambassador Theater, and lunch at the Chinese restaurant on the corner of Flagler and 107th, where the shopping mall is at. I'd also sit with him on the porch where he'd tell me about his life in Cantabria, Spain, as well as his journeys with his uncle Mateo. Eloy Escagedo Valle passed away the 29th of August, 1992, in Miami-Dade County.